So I've watched pretty much all your videos on your channel, and if anybody watching this, please, I'll drop the link down below
You
of
poor thing.
Alex's channel. It's it's incredible. And I've watched one recently with you in doing a test expedition in Canada, where you're using single skin tents in -40. I mean, it said -45, but it actually I believe it reached the bottom of the thermometer where it didn't go anymore. How many layers do you wear in that sort of thing, and how on earth do you deal with the cold? I mean, I've put my blue lights on in the background to try and represent cold, but I've got the heating on, so that doesn't really count. How many layers? How do you even survive that long?
Yes, so do I. I certainly have the heating on here. People often assume that because of what I do for a living that I absolutely adore being cold. Now, actually, the skill of being an Arctic traveler, a cold weather traveler, is that you become rather good at becoming as comfortable as you possibly can. And that was exactly what we were trying to do in that tent at I think it was -44. I couldn't quite claim 45 on that particular night. Although last winter when I was up in Alaska, my teammate and I did get -47. So that's now my personal record for travel. At each sort of threshold of temperature, let's say -20, -30, -40, -50, people think, oh, that just sounds incredibly cold, and it's difficult to understand how they affect the way that you have to behave and how things perform. At -20, if you're well dressed and you're exercising, it really is quite comfortable, assuming that there's not a howling wind. And I've got footage of me skiing along at -20, -25 with an open with an open jacket, chatting to my camera and having a nice day. At -30, you need to really switch on and pay attention to your extremities, and also look after your equipment that little bit more, because certainly plastics start to become slightly more fragile in low temperatures. Once you hit -40, your priority more or less shifts from mileage, because normally what you're trying to do is cover as many miles as you possibly can during the day, assuming you're not doing a science survey, assuming you're doing an exploratory journey. And it starts to shift more through to self-care and care, of course, for your teammates. It's about not making any mistakes. And when you get towards about -45, I mean, even camping, which is supposed to be the comfortable, pleasant time of the day, you have to just really pay attention to everything. In a single skin tent, it's not going to make a massive amount of difference, because you don't have the sun shining down and giving you a nice sort of greenhouse effect. And really, you're not going to expect an incredibly thin layer of nylon, whether it's one or two layers thick, to really hold a great deal of heat in. And besides, we don't heat the tent. You're supposed to be very strict with the stove, so that it's only doing something specific, like drying out something that's accidentally got damp, or melting snow to make hot water. And if you saw a couple of clips in that video on YouTube where the burners were just running, that was a bit naughty. We shouldn't have been doing that. You're supposed to shut those off straight after the stoves are actually doing something. So the temperature inside the tent is not a great deal different to what it is outside. And you've just got to wear the right gear. Now, when you're actually traveling, you don't wear that much gear at all. And people are often surprised as to how little I do have on. If you are holding a big, heavy sledge behind you, a sledge that can weigh 150 up to 200 kilos, that's a lot of work going on. And so as long as those calories are going in, you'll keep yourself warm wearing a merino wool base layer, and then essentially maybe a soft shell windproof. You don't want any waterproof clothing, because you're not going to get rained on. What you want is breathable clothing to let any moisture from within to get out, because you don't want to get damp. Damp is the absolute killer. So when you're exercising, you don't want to wear that much, even at -45. It's when you stop, then you're putting the tent up, camping, maybe doing some science work, communicating using the satellite phone. That's when you do layer up. And so I then have insulated trousers and an insulated jacket to keep me warm when I'm there. Now, the traditional clothing for keeping warm has more or less since the advent of sort of baffled clothing has been goose down, and there are issues around whether that's an ethical idea or not. And of course, there have been big strides in making sure that goose down clothing or duck down clothing comes from good sources. But it's only really useful in the spring or the summer. And I often laugh when people are walking around when it's raining outside in down jackets, because they just turn into a damp papier-mâché. It only works when they're dry. And if you get any dampness into it whatsoever, you'll end up with blocks of ice forming inside the goose down.
Oh,
So actually, these
course.
days, because I do travel in the dark a lot, I tend to use goose down equivalent, like a synthetic insulation, and that works a lot better when you can't leave it out in the sun to dry out.
So you've got to keep your extremities warm. I saw a clip of you with the two burners on and your feet both sides of the burners. Is it important when it gets to a certain level?
That was a luxury, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably naughty there. But if you get to a certain level of cold where it goes past, what point does it become cold into frostbite?
Well, frostbite's a complicated thing because I think most people just assume frostbite means when your fingers go black and fall off. And that's obviously the most extreme form of frostbite. So you can get cold damage to your body, whether it's to your nose, cheeks. They're quite susceptible. Earlobes, if you actually accidentally let an earlobe just sit below the level of your beanie hat or whatever head protection you're wearing, that can quite easily get bitten. And then obviously toes and fingers. And you can get a bit of a shot across the bowels sometimes and get a bit of a warning if you do make a mistake. And I've had that a few times whereby I've just pushed it a little bit too far. I've allowed a finger or a toe get a little bit colder than I should have before doing something active to sort that problem out. And then you'll generally lose sensation. They'll turn white, but that's completely recoverable. That just means that the blood flow is having trouble getting into that extremity, and you've then got to actively rewarm it. And down below -40, you should be almost more than you should be thinking about navigating. You should be thinking about, how's my big toe? Yep, that big toe is good. How's that big toe? Constantly wiggling them around to reconfirm to yourself that they're still alive. And the same thing for your fingers and for your thumbs. And so if you let that go too far, if you're just a little bit blasé and you think, oh, it'll be fine. Okay. All I need to do is ski a little bit faster. That'll come back to life again. Then you can get a problem if you don't actively rewarm an extremity that is getting cold. And then beyond the blood flow pulling back from that extremity, which is what the body does to try and look after itself. It's a bit of a counterintuitive behavior that it undertakes. If that tissue actually freezes, if the skin and then the flesh beneath it actually freezes, those cells will of course die, and then that's going to be the first stage of frostbite. And even that, to a certain extent, that can just simply turn into a minor wound, and the body can actually recover. The nerves can recover, and that's a very painful process as the nerves essentially wake up again days or weeks later, and you get this horrible stinging sensation. But if you again ignore that happening, you can get large chunks of tissue freezing, literally freezing solid. All the water within the cells completely freeze. And at that point, you will then eventually have loss of the end of a finger or even worse. And that's when things go black and fall off. And of course, because that flesh then starts to essentially rot, you can then get toxins ending up in your blood, and that can cause blood poisoning. And that's why something what you could say is only cosmetic, perhaps like the loss of a finger, that can actually kill you because of what is then released into your bloodstream.
Wow, that's amazing. I bet some amateurs go out, don't they, and they don't really know all of this. They've not really experienced, and I think they probably struggle, don't they?
I think so, yes. There are two sides to this. I don't believe that because what I do for a living gives me the sole right to go and travel in remote parts of the world. I've worked very hard over the years to get good at what I do, and I've specialized in one particular sort of travel. I didn't want to be like a generalist adventurer who's a bit rubbish at everything. I'd like to be as good as I can possibly get at my one sort of specialization. But people who don't have much experience, yes, they are at greater risk of wearing the wrong clothes, behaving in the wrong way. A very common mistake amongst amateurs or beginners is to simply wear too much clothing because they think, well, at the beginning of the day, it's really cold, I'll put all this on. They start moving, and then all of a sudden, they're a sweaty heap. All that sweat then turns to ice, and then all of a sudden, they're in serious trouble.
Couple of fun bits. Pringles. Are you sponsored by Pringles, Alex? Because in all of your...
I am not sponsored by Pringles
with you.
but I'm always a firm believer in putting your money where your mouth is. So I would never work with a brand that I haven't spent my own money on beforehand. And so I suppose that's an invitation to whichever company owns Pringles. They're absolutely delicious, as we all know. They are strangely calorie dense. I know that most people know that they're not particularly healthy. But even in terms of the density of calories that we try and get through expedition food, they're not too far off. But most usefully, once they're all gone, that tube, I mean, you don't want too many of them, but that tube is very useful for really forcing down into the bottom wrappers, little bits of rubbish. And so instead of a huge bulging rubbish bin, which you at some point need to get rid of, or maybe incinerate one evening and then sort of compact that down, instead you can force all your little wrappers into this tube, and it makes the inside of your sled a little bit neater. So it's also like a housekeeping tip as well, using Pringles cans.
So Pringles brand, if you're listening, sponsorship opportunity.
I'm not generally expecting an entire wholesale change of the population to start using Pringles cans as rubbish bins, but anyhow.